This is my presentation on the impact of neonatal pain on infants in the Neonatal Intensive Care Unit, or the NICU. Just some background information on me. My name is Chelsea. I am a biology student in the School of Biological Sciences at Washington State University. And the reason I specifically chose this article was because I myself actually spent an extended period of time in the NICU. I was born at about 32 weeks gestation and spent 6 or 7 weeks in the NICU, and a lot of the stuff talked about in this article was something that I experienced, such as endotracheal intubation and heel lances, all that kind of stuff that we'll get into. I was experiencing, and I actually was also an infant that was being used for studies for this kind of research. I was doing MRI scans and all of that, so I was very interested to learn a bit more about what that data was being used for and how they were using it and applying it to research now. Just for some brief introduction into this topic, survival rates for preterm births are continuing to increase worldwide, and more research is being done on the neurodevelopmental outcomes of these live births. So in the United States alone, from 2021 to 2022, the preterm birth rate was roughly 10.4%. This means about every 1 in 10 live births was considered preterm. Oftentimes when a child is born preterm, they have to spend some time or extended period of time in the NICU, and longer stays in the NICU are linked to sensory processing difficulties. Frequent procedural pain can cause stress and vulnerability of the thalamus, which is a major relay station in charge of receiving sensory information from the body. And the reason this is important here is because the NICU is often a very stressful situation for these preterm infants, and they also are often getting procedural pain from heel lances, endotracheal intubations, or things like venipunctures, which are just necessary things that happen in the NICU. Structural connectivity of the thalamus to the cortex is associated with early neurodevelopmental outcomes in preterm infants, and this study specifically aimed to determine the relationship between neonatal thalamic growth and later processing abilities of what this study defined as very preterm infants, which is less than 28 weeks gestation at birth, and then they followed up with them later at around age 4.5. As the survival rate of preterm births continues to rise, it's important to understand the effects of long-term associations of early pain or stress in neonatal thalamic growth. The corresponding author for this article is Dr. Ruth E. Grinnell. She is a professor in the Division of Neonatology in the Department of Pediatrics and is an associate member of the Department of Psychology at the University of British Columbia. She received the 2018 Jeffrey Lawson Award for Advocacy in Children's Pain Relief, and her research focuses on biobehavioral reactivity and infant neurodevelopment, covering multiple aspects of infant arousal, self-regulation, attention, cognition, and brain development in infants. And based on all this, she's definitely a credible researcher and source based on her background in neonatology, pediatrics, and psychology. The hypothesis is not explicitly stated in this article, but it can be inferred based on their focus of study that the hypothesis is that neonatal pain exposure in very preterm infants would be associated with altered thalamic development, which in turn would be linked to sensory processing difficulties later on in childhood. This study is an observational longitudinal cohort study. The researchers did not intervene experimentally, and there was no randomization or controlled intervention. Rather, a small cohort was chosen and surveyed, making it an epidemiological study. For this study, they gathered a sample demographic, and this sample for this experiment included 81 neonates that were born what this experiment defined as extremely preterm, which was 24 to 28 weeks gestational age, and 59 neonates that were born very preterm, which is defined as 29 to 32 weeks of gestational age. The researchers chose to split up their method section into kind of 4 subsections. So the first one is neonatal data collection, and researchers documented neonatal pain exposure, which was measured by the number of painful procedures undergone in the NICU. I mentioned earlier some examples of these painful exposures include heel lances, which are common for obtaining blood samples in infants, venipunctures, which are common for blood sampling or intravenous therapy, and endotracheal intubations, which include inserting a tube into the trachea to assist with breathing. And all 3 of these kind of more pain exposures are often really common for children in the NICU. A lot of times these things are happening with heel lances and stuff that can be happening once or twice a day, maybe more depending on the situation. Their next subsection was neuroimaging, or MRI. So the researchers did structural MRI scans to evaluate thalamic volume during infancy. And then their third subsection was the follow-up. So when children reached 4.5 years old, researchers assessed their sensory processing behaviors through parent-reported questionnaires. Researchers specifically used the Short Sensory Profile, or SSP, questionnaire. The SSP contains 38 items organized into 7 subscales, and these subscales test different categories like tactile sensitivity, taste-smell sensitivity, auditory filtering, low energy, and visual sensitivity. And the frequency of each item is then rated on a scale ranging from 5, which is, never, to 1, always. Then they had their analysis section. So each of these SSP questionnaires were summed to create a total score. Lower scores on the SSP generally reflect greater sensory problems. Researchers examined relationships between neonatal pain, thalamic volume, and sensory processing outcomes to determine if early pain exposure influenced later brain development and behavior. They were able to support this by using the MRI scans and comparing them to the SSP scores that were calculated from the questionnaire. Children who had better thalamic growth eventually had lower scores on the SSP questionnaire, suggesting that they had fewer sensory problems. Individuals who were subjected to less early life pain exposure in the NICU, for example, those with fewer painful procedures, experienced better thalamic maturation when compared to those with a high number of invasive procedures. I briefly touched a bit on results on the last slide, but I'm going to go a bit more in depth here, and we have some lovely graphs here for reference. So researchers found that greater exposure to neonatal pain in very preterm infants was associated with reduced thalamic volumes in early childhood, as measured through MRI scans. Since the thalamus is a key brain structure involved in sensory processing, the researchers examined whether these structural differences were linked to sensory outcomes by a required parent-reported questionnaire, which was the SSP, as I mentioned on the last slide, and their results indicated that children with smaller thalamic volumes exhibited more sensory processing difficulties, including heightened sensitivity or aversion to sensory stimuli as reported by their parents. So this is kind of reflected on this upper graph here. You can see that children with lower thalamus weekly growth here on the bottom experienced lower SSP scores, which would reflect the sensory processing difficulties that they reported there. These findings suggest that early life pain exposure in the NICU may disrupt normal thalamic development, leading to long-term challenges in sensory regulation. And then on this bottom graph here, You can see the bottom, the x-axis is total skin breaks, and you can see that when they had higher number of heel lances or skin breaks, they actually tended to score lower on the SSP scale, which also reflects sensory processing difficulties. And this just highlights the importance of pain management strategies in preterm infants to potentially mitigate neurodevelopmental consequences. Obviously, the main job of doctors, nurses, and staff is to keep this baby alive, so not all of this can be, completely undone or not done at all. But it's important to keep this in mind that potentially more painful procedures could lead to sensory processing difficulties later on. Researchers concluded that children born very preterm demonstrate sensory processing deficits in several domains, including auditory, somatosensory, and visual domains. In neonates born extremely preterm, sensory processing deficits were predicted by procedural pain exposure early in life. They found that children with dysregulated sensory processing scores at 4.5 years old had slower neonatal thalamic growth. Therefore, the hypothesis that was inferred early on in the introduction is supported by the data collected in this research. While that is what the author concluded for this data set, there are some other conclusions that could be drawn from this data, and one of those main alternate conclusions is that preterm birth itself is the primary factor affecting thalamic development. That's one of the variables that was common for all tested infants, was they were all born preterm. And preterm birth can cause complications like hypoxia, inflammation, and altered brain maturation in itself, which means it could be the main cause of reduced thalamic volume that was surveyed in this research. My conclusions personally, based on the data presented in the article, I think the author's conclusions are supported. There does seem to be an association between neonatal pain experiences and sensory processing behavior. However, I do think it is really important to take note of some other factors like preterm birth itself affecting neonatal development rather than the pain that is being experienced by these neonates in the hospital. So just to kind of summarize what this research found, this study highlights the long-term impact of neonatal pain exposure on brain development and sensory processing in very preterm children. The researchers found that greater neonatal pain exposure was associated with smaller thalamic volumes, and these structural differences were linked to greater sensory processing dysfunction in early childhood. These findings suggest that early life pain experiences, particularly pain in the NICU, may disrupt thalamic development, potentially leading to long-term neurodevelopmental challenges. If there are any questions about my presentation or about this research article, I will be more than happy to answer them.